Alright, so the very first question. Can we use test.startTest and stopTest inside test setup methods? Alright, so this question talks about whether we can use test.startTest and stopTest within our test setup method. So let's go ahead and create a test class. I'll create an Apex class and I'll name it test class checker test. Now let's annotate this with isTest because that is mandatory for a class to be called a test class, and let's create a test setup method with the annotation test setup. Right, let me save this. Alright, now let's add the test.startTest and stopTest annotation methods here, and let's try to just save it with these two lines of code. Alright, so the first stage is clear, which means it's not giving any compiler error. That means we can write some code here to certify whether this block actually works or not, right? Let's do something. Let's insert a new record for account. I'll enter the mandatory parameter, which is name, and I'll insert one more account outside this block just to be super sure. I'll name this test account or new account 2, right? And let's save this. And just to certify this, let me create a test method, check account size, and I can use system.assert equals expected is 2, and I'll be comparing the size of my account list, right? So I can say select id from account dot size. So if this works fine and the test class runs successfully, which means our block inside the test.startTest and stopTest has executed successfully. Let's click on the run test method once the class is saved. Yeah. Okay, so there's an error, and that's because I did a small mistake. This should not be assert not equals, this should be assert equals. Let me just save this. And now let's run it. Yep, so our assertion has worked fine, which means this block is executing perfectly fine along with this block, and that concludes that yeah, we can use start test and stop test inside our test setup method. Alright, so the second question is, suppose there are 10 duplicate records in an object and you want to delete 9 of them and retain the latest record. How would you do it? Alright, moving on to the next question, which asks, if there are multiple duplicate records in the system, how do you eliminate or get rid of all the other duplicates and keep or retain only the last record that's been created? So for this, let me create another Apex class, and I'll name it duplicate eliminator class, right? A duplicate record and eliminator class. Okay. And before we start working on the Apex code side of it, let me just create some duplicate records. And for this, let's consider the contact object and create some duplicates there. So I'll just go to the app launcher, find contacts, and I'll just create some duplicate records. Now when we say duplicates, we need to identify them by some specific parameter, right? So let's click on new and let's see if we can define some parameters. All right, let's just say that the name and the lead source, if these two values match for two different records, we call them duplicates. All right, so let me just create some duplicate records by keeping the same for all the records. So I'll just call it contact 1 and I'll have the lead source as web. I'll save and new. I'll create a similar record, a potential duplicate, contact 1, lead source web. I'll just create one more record, keep the same name, and the lead source as web. So now we have 3 records in the system, right? And all of them have the same name and the lead source, and that's how we want to find duplicates. So let's quickly go to developer console and go to the query editor and quickly query the contact records, right? So let me just put a filter where lead source is web and name is contact one. So we have three records, right? And if we just have to double check the lead source, this should be web for all these three records. Now what we want to do is we want to remove or eliminate the two records and keep the one that's latest or that's been created very recently, right? And that can be done by Apex. So let's head over to Apex, and before that let me just put an order by clause here just to check which record is the latest record. Right, so the record created today at 3:37:37 is the latest one, right? So we'll try to make sure that we delete these two records through our code and this record still stays as is, right? Let's head over to our Apex class and create a method that checks for duplicates and eliminates them. All right, so I'll just call it eliminate duplicates method. And what are the parameters that we are looking for, or that would be our identifiers? Those would be the contact name and the lead source, right? So we are assuming that these two parameters will be populated by the UI component or from somewhere so that the method can execute accordingly, right? So first of all, what we need to do is we need to write a SOQL query. So let's find all the duplicates first. For that, I'll query the SOQL for contact records, and I'll use the same query, right? This right here. I can just use this and I can just modify this. So select ID comma name comma, I don't need these fields here though. I can just keep ID from contact where lead source is equal to the lead source that's provided to the method and name is equal to the name that's provided to the method, right? So I'll just bind these two parameters and then order by created date desk, or we can keep, we need to remove desk because this will give the latest records first. So now this should work and give a list of records in the ascending order of the created date, which means the record that was created first will appear first on the list, right? Now let's do something. Let's create a for loop and eliminate, or identify which are these records. So what I'll be doing is I'll be looping through 1 until the con record size, which means this iteration will run how many times? This should run 2 times because the records that I'll be getting on my SOQL here is 3, and since I'm starting with 1, this will execute once and then it will execute for I equal to 2. So there will be 2 iterations. And why are we trying to do this? Because we want to keep the last record and just eliminate the first 2 records, right? So if you had 10 records and you would want to eliminate the 9 records, you'll iterate it from 1 to 9 automatically. That would work for all kind of numbers, right? So now that I have my loop ready, what I can do is I can create a list. I'll call it records to remove, and I could add my con records item in here. Make sense? So how will this iterate? So con records will have 3 records, right? Con records would have 3 records in real time, and this iteration will start off, it will start for 1, it will check whether I is less than 3, which is true. It will come in here and it will add the con records of 1 to the list, right? Or what we can also do is we can start from 0 and we can use less than -1, right? Just to keep intact the array concept. All right, now it's giving me an error saying records to remove does not exist, so we'll just create a list. And this would again be a records, this would again be a contact list, so I'll just call it new list of contact, right? And what we need to do now, we just need to use the delete statement to delete these 2 records, right? Let's click on save and let's execute this chunk of code from our anonymous window, which is right here. Open execute anonymous window. I can just call my class, and since the method is static, I'll be calling the method directly. And let's put in the parameters. So what are the parameters? The first parameter should be the name, right? So the name will be contact1 and the lead source should be web. Now let's try to execute it. So this has successfully executed, and let's now check this query and execute it again. So you see, two records have gone away and just the one with 33737 is here, which means our code has worked perfectly fine. So just to recap, what did we do? We created a method. We took some identifiers that would act as finding potential duplicates in the system. We wrote a SOQL query wherein we ordered our records by created date ascending, because we wanted to just keep the latest record, which is right at the end of the SOQL or of the list. And we used our parameters to filter out our contact records. And then we normally iterated a loop and just added those records in our list, and then added a DML statement to delete those records. All right, cool. Let's move on to the next question. So the third question is, how would you resolve SOQL 101 exceptions? So the maximum number of SOQL queries we can run through in a single transaction is 100. Now once this limit is exceeded, Salesforce throws a system.limit exception, saying too many SOQL queries. Now this could happen due to multiple reasons. You might have written the SOQL inside the loop. You have actually written 100 plus SOQL statements. There is recursion in the code. Right? So to avoid this, or when you run into this error, first you need to debug the transaction by adding in debug logs and monitoring the number of times each SOQL is executing. Next, review your code and see why those specific queries are being executed so many times, or if you have not followed the best practices and have added queries within loops. Refactor the code to adhere to best practices, see if the code is running in recursion. If so, add checks for recursion, and then lastly, also check if there's any code module that can run independently. If that's the case, you can add it to a future method, which in turn will run in async mode and help you save some limits in the synchronous transaction. This should solve your SOQL 101 exception. Since this limit cannot be extended by Salesforce and it is a hard limit, we will always have to adhere to it, which in turn means write good code and follow best practices. So let's look at the fourth question. What could be the potential issue when you have multiple triggers for the same object? The very next question is, what is the potential issue if we have multiple triggers for the same object, right? We know that we should not be writing multiple triggers, and Salesforce avoids, or asks us to follow the best practices and not write multiple triggers. But what could be the problem and why is that a problem? Let's look into that today. So first of all, I'll just check if my logs are enabled. All right, yeah, I can see the logs, and the last log is of 5.1 KB. That's fine. Let's now just create a new contact trigger. Let's go to file and create a trigger first of all. So I'll just name it contact trigger. So we'll try to figure out what goes wrong when we have potential, multiple triggers for the same object. So I'll just name this contact trigger and I'll point it to the contact object. Click on submit, right? And let me create one more trigger and let's see if Salesforce automatically stops me from doing it. I'll just name it contact trigger 2 and I'll call it, say, submit. So I have been able to create two records, two trigger files for the same object, right? Which means Salesforce is still not stopping me from it, but it's kind of saying me that you should not be doing it through the best practices and the documentation. So what I would just want to check out is, I would probably just use the before insert and after insert events, and I'll just add some logs in here just to check how things work or how things behave. So I'll just add the trigger events, trigger dot is before, and then I'll have one more code chunk which would be for after insert, right? So I'll just call it after here. Let's save it. I'll add a debug statement just to track how things proceed, and I'll say before insert called for contact trigger, right? I'll use the same debug statement here, just modify the statement to say after insert, and let's copy this entire code segment and paste it in our second trigger as well. And all we will change is just the debug statement. So call from contact trigger 2 and after insert call from contact trigger 2. Cool. I forgot to add the event here, which might stop it from calling. So now I have before insert and after insert. Right? Now that we have two trigger files for the same object setup, let's go into the contact record and create a new contact. Let's see what happens. So just click on new, set test con, and I think that's the only mandatory field, and I'll just go ahead and click on save. So my record got created, which means I still did not face any issues, but let's go to the developer console and see what has come up in the logs, right? So let me just open all the 4 logs that have come up just to be super sure where is our debug log hiding. So let's just open all these 4. All right, so if you see that this is for the duplicate detector that we wrote earlier, and this is not the log of our concern, and if I click on the debug only checkbox, we don't see any logs. Similarly, I think this is similar to that. I don't see any debug logs, which means we can eliminate this log as well. This is also same. Let's close this, and I think this should be the one that we should be concerned with. So I'll just check on debug only, and you see before insert for contact trigger ran first, then before insert for contact trigger 2 ran first, after insert for contact trigger ran after this, and then contact trigger 2, which means what Salesforce internally tried to do is it executed contact trigger first and contact trigger 2 next, but that's not sure every time. It's not certain that Salesforce will pick up this file every time, and that comes as a problem when we have multiple triggers. Now let's assume that you have some kind of logic in here and then some kind of logic written in here, and you kind of want this logic to execute first, but Salesforce can neither guarantee nor the transaction can certify which file would be picked first and what event will be executed first. Now, since before insert is present on both files, how do we identify and understand which particular syntax will go first, right? That becomes a problem, and that creates issues like dependencies, row locking, and uncertainty of how data will flow or how data will be set up, right? And that's the problem of having multiple triggers in the system. So this is why Salesforce asks you to follow the best practices and avoid having multiple triggers, because the problem lands back on us and we won't be able to identify what code snippet will execute, even though we have a specific line of code written on both the before insert events. Now today that we see, the log has contact trigger record created first and then contact trigger 2 code executed later, but this is not sure and this won't be every single time. So that's the problem what we have with multiple triggers in the same object. Okay. All right, let's move on to the next question. All right, let's look at the fifth question. So how would you insert 2 million records in Salesforce? All right, so the next question is, how do you insert more than 50,000 records or maybe around 5 million records into the Salesforce system, right? So any kinds of import that goes beyond 50,000 records cannot be accomplished by the standard data import wizard, right? For that, what we have is a tool that's called data loader, right? So if you see this right here, I have data loader installed in my machine, and we can use data loader to import, export, and do any kind of CRUD operations. So once this opens up, this is how the window looks like for data loader. I'll just click on insert records, right? But before that, I need to prepare a CSV file that contains my records. So if you see right here, I've prepared a CSV file that has around 55,000 rows, which means there are 54,999 records to be inserted. I've only added name and lead source fields as my 2 parameters, and let's just export this file into a CSV format, and let's click on next. Contact import, right? Let me remove the capitalization and click on export. So my CSV file has been exported. All right, now I can go back to my data loader and click on insert, and once I click on insert, it gives me an environment option whether it's a production or a sandbox, but since we are on a developer edition, we'll go with production and we'll try to log in. So this will ask for a prompt for username and password. Let's paste our username and our password. I'll just say login. and this asks for a verification code first. Okay, so the email verification code is 72959. I suppose that's what it is. 72959, yeah. So let's click on verify. So it's asking whether the data loader can access your basic permissions, and this is something that we'll have to allow. And once we allow it, it verifies the credentials, and it says login successful, and the next button appears. So now that I click on the next button, it gives me some standard objects, but if I want to see some other objects, I can click on show all. This opens up all the objects that's present, right? So let's disable this and let's select contact, because that's something that we want to import. And it says choose your CSV file, so I'll just click on browse. I'll go to desktop, and my CSV file is here, right? Contact import. Let's click on open, and let's click on next. So this says your operation will contain 54,999 records, and that's something that you want. So let's click on OK, and it opens up the mapping file. So there are two fields, right? I can either select choose an existing map if there's one, or I can just create a new one. So let's create a new one for this. So when you click on create, you can either auto match the fields based on the name, or you can just drag and drop them here, right? So once you drag and drop them, this gets mapped. So what you're trying to say is that the facts field would probably be pointed to the name, which is incorrect, right? So let me clear the mapping and click on auto match. So lead source is automatically matched, if you see, and for name I'll just select the last name. Right, now let's click on OK, and this is our mapping, and we are saying that the last name should be populated with name and the lead source will be populated with the lead source. And let's click on next. Let's click on finish. It's asking for a directory where it wants me to store uh, the error and success logs. So I'll just name a folder called logs and click on create, and I'll select this and click on open. Let's click on finish. Now this says you have chosen to insert new records. Click yes to begin. I'll say, do you want to proceed? Yes. So it starts the insert here, right? So you see that the processing has started, and it's taking 200 records at a time, and it's showing you the successes and the errors, right? And as we see, records are getting inserted into the Salesforce system. So if I were to log in here and go to the contacts list view, you should be able to see under all contacts, records are coming up, right? So you see some records popping up here. These are the records getting inserted through a data loader. So any kind of records, any number of records which surpasses the 50,000 mark can be accomplished using the data loader that you have. And this is free to install, and this is available on your Salesforce setup. If you want to install it, you just have to click on the setup icon here and just type data loader in the quick find box. So if I type data loader here, so you see this option right here under integrations. If I just click on data loader, this opens up the option and provides me a link either for Macintosh or for your Windows machine you can install, and there are instructions based on which you can install it. All right, let's look at the next question. All right, let's look at the sixth question. So I want my trigger to be recursive 3 times. After that, recursion should stop. So how do I achieve it? So let's look at the contact trigger for this use case, and let me just quickly remove this chunk of code that we wrote for our other question, and let me go ahead and do the same for the contact trigger 2 that we had also created, right? So let me just go ahead into this and I can just delete this particular file so that we don't have any kind of conflicts. Cool. So now we have the contact trigger file, and we have the relevant events here before insert and after insert, which is fine. And we want to tackle recursion, and we want it to occur naturally for 3 times and then stop, right? So the normal tendency to use triggers is you don't write your code in the trigger, you use a handler for it, right? So let me just add up some more events. So let's say we are tackling an after update scenario, and we want to add the event checks here. If trigger dot is after and trigger dot is update, then you'd want your trigger to do all kind of activities after update. So right, so I'll just create a handler class, and I'll say activities after update, and I'll pass my trigger.new parameter, which is available, right? And since I don't have this class created, let me just go ahead and create a handler class. So I'll just name it contact trigger handler, click on OK, and this should have a method that says activities after update, right? So let me just create this method as well so that I can save the trigger file. Say public static void, and the parameter should be list of contact records or new records that have come up in the system. That's trigger.new. So I'll say contact and I'll save this. Right, and this method is nothing but just to execute your after update logic. So all any kind of logic that you'll be probably writing, you'll be writing it here, and it will be called from your trigger class. So now once we save this handler file, yeah, it's successfully saved. Let's try to save our trigger file now. Yeah, so the trigger file is also saved, which means our basic syntax of trigger and a handler is set up correctly. And now what we want to do is we want to tackle recursion, right? So we want to tackle recursion and allow recursion 3 times, right? Not more than that. So normally what we do is if we have to check or uncheck recursion or block or unblock recursion, we normally use a boolean variable. So we go to our handler file and we declare a static variable, right? Public static boolean check recursive, or just say check recursion, or just say is first time, right? So we define variables like this and we set it as false initially, right? And once we have this boolean setup and it's a static variable, this static boolean variable is consistent for a single transaction. So for a single transaction, the value from is first time will not be updated multiple times. It will stay whatever it is, and based on the transaction changes, the value changes. So if I come to my trigger, what I have to simply do is inside my event, I can just say if contact trigger handler dot is first time, only then execute the code. Okay, and once the contact trigger handler is first time loop evaluates to true and the code comes in here, what we simply do is we change the boolean flag to false, right? And since I have defined it like this, what I need to do is I need to define my boolean flag as true for the very first time as default. So is first time will be set as true, and then when I come to my contact trigger, for the very first time when the event occurs, it will check whether contact trigger handler is first time is equal to true. Yeah, currently it's true, right? So it will evaluate to true and it will go inside, and once it comes inside, this value will be explicitly set to false, and then all your operations will be done, which is your update activities, right? And once your is first time is set to false, and since this is a static variable, this will stay consistent and as false for this entire apex transaction. So the next time if a recursion occurs, or recursion occurs because of some kind of workflow field update or a process builder change, and your trigger code is executed again, this line of code will be checked, and now contact trigger handler dot is first time will be evaluated as false, which means this won't get inside the code block, right? So this is the traditional method of how we handle recursion, and how we handle recursion if we want to avoid recursion after the first execution, right? But the scenario here is we want the recursion to be allowed for 3 times. Now when we have a count instead of a single time, what we can simply change our logic to is we can use a integer variable, right? As simple as that. So I'll just say recursion count is equal to 3, right? So I'm defining a static integer variable and I'll call it recursion count. And now instead of using my is first time variable, what I'll be doing is I'll check if recursion count is not equal to 0, then execute the code, but before executing, decrease the value of the recursion count by 1, right? Let's understand what we did here. So if recursion count is not equal to 0, which means for the first iteration it's equal to 3, so it's not equal to 0, which evaluates to true, it will come inside and it will reduce the value by 1. So the next time this will be evaluated to 2. Similarly, after one more time it will be evaluated to 1, and for the third time it will evaluate to 0. Now on the fourth time when it comes in, it will check if recursion count is not equal to 0, which becomes false after 3 times. Agreed? So this code block will not execute after 3 times. and that's how we can tackle recursion scenarios when we want to allow them multiple times. So this could be a good interview question, but this is not a good practice to have in Salesforce. You would not want your recursion code, or your trigger to recurse 3 times in the system. All right, but yeah, this comes as an interview question, which is why I wanted to discuss this. All right, so far so good. Let's move on to the next question.